It was 3 or 4 years ago I presented to this meeting actually the results of the ENIGMA trial, which is a big multi-centre trial, 7,000 patients looking at the safety of nitrous oxide with particular focus on cardiovascular outcomes in patients randomised to nitrous or nitrous-free anaesthesia, and essentially confirmed its safety. But there are a few loose ends. Now, we all know it's got quite unique pharmacokinetics. It's low solubility. We're taught produces a rapid peaking of alveolar partial pressure and an achievement of steady state. In actual fact, though, most other craft groups or specialties would think of nitrous as being a soluble gas, not an insoluble gas. It's 20 times more soluble, of course, than nitrogen, and therefore is more highly diffusible. Now, this is a very low-tech presentation I'm making here. This is as high-tech as my talk's going to get. That's Fick's law of diffusion, which basically points out that the solubility of the agent is a critical factor in the rate of diffusion of a gas across a membrane down a partial pressure gradient. And the much higher solubility of nitrous oxide than nitrogen is thought to promote expansion of air-filled spaces, pneumothorax, the middle ear, pneumocephalus. We're all familiar with these relative contraindications to the use of nitrous oxide. Also in the globe, the eye, but it's more to do with SF6 as the insoluble gas, but also bowel distension. So the three questions are: does bowel distension actually happen with nitrous oxide? How do you measure it? And thirdly, is it really a clinical problem? So I can't answer all those questions, but I think I can answer some of them. Now, in fact, they were addressed just a few years ago by Mukata Oransanga, who was actually at the meeting last year. We should have got her to do this, Jan. No? Yeah. You should have thought of it last year. And she did a meta-analysis of all the published studies in the literature looking at nitrous oxide versus nitrous-free anaesthesia, which made some measurements of its effect on bowel function, in particular focused on bowel distension. And there's a bit of a polyglot of studies. There's about 9 or 10 studies there, about probably 5 or 6 of them are relevant to this particular topic that we're talking about this morning. They're very heterogeneous. There's a whole range of clinical endpoints that they address. Some of them measured abdominal girth before and after surgery, return to bowel function, PONV, length of stay in hospital, I don't know. Anyway, they had a mixture of open and laparoscopic surgery in the mix, and the study size varied between 20 patients, and one study had 340 patients. So a real polyglot mixture, the sort of typical mixture that you encounter when you try and synthesise the literature base in our field, in almost on any clinical question. So the particular endpoints that they're interested in, which is what Jan's raised, is does it cause bowel distension, and what effect did this have on the operating conditions that the surgeons reported? And this was all, but generally the technique that was used was that the surgeons themselves would be asked to rate these two things, or one or both of them, in a blinded fashion to the anaesthetic administered. So this is the data on bowel distension that they were able to put together from that mixture of studies. There were 5 studies, total of 600 patients, where in fact there seemed to be a significant increase in bowel distension with nitrous oxide versus nitrous-free anaesthesia. But most of that data comes from the largest study, the 350 patient study by Ozan Acker, actually one of Mukata's colleagues in the US. So, yep, there is bowel distension. I guess there's no surprises if we understand the underlying mechanics we talked about before. They also pointed out that seemed to be a time-related thing. So for each additional hour of nitrous oxide anaesthesia, the odds ratio of bowel distension increased by a factor of 2. So, in terms of it affecting the operating conditions that the surgeons reported, once again, a bit of a polyglot of methodologies, but this is what the best they were able to put together from that group. There's 146 patients in total amongst 4 studies, and there was no statistically significant difference. But it's a very small sample size, really, to be looking at something like this. As I said, a very polyglot mixture of methodologies and studies. So a bit hard to actually come to a firm conclusion about that. Now, I'm restraining myself at this point from launching into a tirade of criticism of the problem of publication bias in the anaesthesia literature. Because I don't have time, I'm not going to do it. So you're off the hook. But I could go on for hours about this problem. We have a big problem with publication bias, and how you actually make any sense of a literature review like that when there's this terrible background of positive publication bias, I don't know. I don't think you can do it. And I'm hoping that there will be a way out of this era that we've lived in now for generations where we have a significant positive publication bias problem. But anyway, that's I'm digressing, and I won't go down that path any further. So that's the bowel distension thing. I think the answer is it may be a clinical problem, but it doesn't seem to be a particularly bad one. And it's one of a number of things that it's a loose end that we could have actually sorted out when we did the ENIGMA trial, because we had lots of abdominal surgery in the ENIGMA trial, and it would have been very easy to have done a sub-study within that trial in ENIGMA 1 or ENIGMA 2, where we did a similar thing and got some good numbers together and did at least some ratings by the surgeons of operating conditions or something like that. But we didn't do it. We thought it was not important, and it remains an unanswered question. There's one other unanswered question that does really bug me though here, and I feel quite guilty about this, because it's the issue of whether nitrous oxide does contribute to post-operative lung complications. So I'm digressing from my original brief here, Jan, all right? I've had it with the bowels, I'm talking about the lungs now. So we know mechanistically that nitrous oxide, being a relatively soluble gas, promotes absorption atelectasis. In fact, a nitrous oxide-oxygen mixture mechanistically is as potent as breathing pure oxygen in terms of inducing absorption atelectasis in the lungs. We know that from the theoretical considerations. We also know that there's potential for immunosuppression due to interference with the SAM cycle and vitamin B12. ENIGMA 1 in 2007, we discussed this previously, showed an increased incidence of septic complications and also atelectasis and pneumonia in a sample size of 2,000 patients. And we thought we'd prove that nitrous is bad for you, bad for the lungs, immunosuppressive, and we didn't have to worry about that anymore. When we went on to do the much larger ENIGMA 2 trial, we were focusing on cardiovascular outcomes for other reasons. We also collected some surgical site infection data. I don't know why we did it, but we did it. And in fact, we were unable to confirm the findings of ENIGMA 1. So there was no evidence of an effect of nitrous oxide on post-operative infection rates, wound infection or fever or sepsis. However, we didn't bother to collect any data on pulmonary outcomes in ENIGMA 2. Why didn't we do it? Because Paul Miles rang me up one day and he said, Phil, is there any other data we should add to the protocol before we actually finalise the protocol and finalise the CRF and roll out the trial and start recruiting? And I said, no, Paul, I'm happy with everything. We know what we're doing. Anyway, I was stupid because, in fact, in retrospect, looking at the failure of ENIGMA 2 to confirm any of the findings of ENIGMA 1, we really don't know whether those pulmonary findings, those adverse pulmonary outcomes in ENIGMA 1 are real or not. In fact, really, probably, when you look at it, they probably aren't, but I can't prove that to you. And we didn't collect the data. So our ignorance remains. And that's largely my fault because I'm the guy who's supposed to be interested in lung pharmacokinetics and nitrous oxide, and I said, oh, look, it's all right, don't worry about it. So, I'm a mug. I'm sorry. Anyway, the consequence of this is that there is a meta-analysis, another meta-analysis, which has looked at this specific topic, the relationship of nitrous oxide to a variety of adverse outcomes, including pulmonary outcomes, and in fact have shown that it increases atelectasis and pneumonia. But of course, both of these meta-analyses are completely dominated by the ENIGMA 1 trial, which was 2,000 patients. I mean, I don't really know why you bother to do a meta-analysis where one of the trials has got 2,000 patients and the other trials have all got, sort of 50 patients or 100 patients. I mean, this only deepens our ignorance. It doesn't actually tell us anything informative. So the trouble is we're stuck in this situation where the only information we have really comes from ENIGMA 1, and all of a sudden we can have no confidence that trial, that the findings of that trial were real in terms of at least septic outcomes. So, the cut to the chase, I'm in the process of trying to retrospectively go and find all the pulmonary data on all the patients who were in the Australian centres in the ENIGMA II trial, and dig out all their chest X-ray data and other relevant endpoints, and retrospectively see post hoc, if we can, answer that question on the incidence of atelectasis and pneumonia in ENIGMA II. If we get all the Australian centres together, we'll have over 2,500 patients, which would be about 40% of the total recruitments in the trial, almost 40%, and would probably go a long way to showing us if in fact there was any evidence of a trend towards adverse pulmonary outcomes in the ENIGMA II trial. So we're sort of working our way through that. It's quite a complicated process. We should have done it at the time. We didn't, because I'm an idiot, and okay. So we're going to try and do it now and answer that question. Dunscap, that's me. Thank you very much.